Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar today. My name is Shaun Middlebrook. I am a proud Wiradjuri and Yuin man, and I'm the Principal First Nations Advisor for the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. We're delighted for you to be joining us today. Before we kick off the next section of this, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout our nation. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's connections to land, sea, community and respect their cultural, spiritual and educational practices. I'd like to acknowledge that Australia has a dark past that we're trying to move through, and this is part of that work that we do about recognising the injustices that First Nations people experiences across the country, particularly in relation to housing and homelessness. For those of you who don't know us, AHURI is the only independent research network dedicated exclusively to housing and homelessness, cities related and urban research. Our research supports policy development at all levels, government, assists industry, informs the broader community, and builds a bank of research knowledge for people to utilise into the future to influence policy decision. We have coming up, very excitingly, the Australian Homelessness Conference 2026, which will be held from the 7th to the 8th of October in Darwin. In addition to obviously doing webinars, but we also hold these events biannually. The 2027 National Housing Conference is also coming up. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to mention that we do have a chat function in the website, or in the I'm not sure what to call it, but we have the function here that you can ask questions during the presentation as well, and we'll get to those towards the end. Today's webinar will be discussing the framework for the future of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing in Australia, which is the third and final report from the AHURI funded inquiry into developing a long-term governance. I've got to turn my page over because that's missing, and research for sustainable and effective Indigenous housing. The inquiry reports are available on the AHURI website, and we'll talk more to those later in the presentation. If you want to refer to any of them during the webinar, they are also in the handout section of the chat function on the right-hand side. Now we'll move into introducing our presenters, and I've lost my page that I've got in front of me. Apologies all. Where are we? So today's webinar, as I mentioned, will be discussed the framework. So we have Associate Professor Megan Moskos with us from Adelaide University, and we also have Vivienne Milligan, who is University of New South Wales. Yes, I've got that correct without even my notes in front of me. This is going swimmingly already. So what I'll do now is hand over to Megan to begin the presentation on the framework.
Thanks, Shaun. Yes, excellent. Look, thanks first and foremost to Shaun for that introduction, and also to my colleague Viv for being here with me today. But most importantly, thanks for everyone to taking the time out of your busy schedules to be involved in this webinar, particularly given that most of you are probably, like me, in the midst of the trials and tribulations that are Book Week. As Shaun indicated, what we're going to do today is detail the findings arising from our large program of research into the development of long-term governance and resourcing framework for sustainable and effective Indigenous housing. Before we get into our presentation, we'd also like to acknowledge traditional owners. Today I'm joining you from Ghana land. I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I'd also like to extend that respects to First Nations people online today. I'd also like to take this opportunity to give a big shout out to and thank proud Aboriginal artist Nikita Haverfield for producing the artwork that we've used in the final inquiry report, and which we've also tried to bring into this presentation today. So in the webinar today, we're hoping to spend around 25 minutes to take you through why and how we undertook the inquiry program of research, what we found, and also how we think these findings can be addressed moving forward. That will be the formal part of the webinar, and then we'll move into a more facilitated Q&A session. So we're hoping that you can pose your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll attend to them at the conclusion of the formal presentation. Excellent. So overall, our inquiry program of research aimed to provide policymakers and practitioners with comprehensive evidence and recommendations for the future support of Indigenous housing in Australia. So the research was undertaken between 2023 and 2025 and sought to investigate governance and regulatory arrangements in Indigenous housing, self-determination in Indigenous housing policy and provision, and the resourcing, supply and management of Indigenous housing. I think it's really important to note here and from the outset that the research was very much national in its focus, and we did not delve down extensively to each jurisdiction or regional area. Our focus was clearly on the future of Indigenous housing system at the national level. I also want to give a shout out to colleagues involved in this research. It was by no means a solo effort. It was shaped and informed by a team of researchers from right around Australia, including my colleague Viv Milligan from UNSW, I'll give a shout out to again, Richard Benedict and Genevieve Murray from University of Sydney, Daphne Habibas from University of Tasmania, Liam Greeley from Menzies School of Health Research in Northern Territory, Mike Dockery from Curtin in WA, Rhonda Phillips from Queensland, and of course my colleagues here at Adelaide University, particularly Linda Isherwood. So the research was undertaken across two main stages. Stage one involved undertaking a literature review, a quantitative and qualitative mapping of the Indigenous housing system in Australia, targeted consultations with key informants, and also a housing needs analysis. So this stage of the research uncovered key elements of the Indigenous housing system that we obviously needed to understand further. So in the second stage of the research, we sought to do just that by way of 8 in-depth case studies of various elements of the Indigenous housing system. So the case study approach involved a desktop analysis of documents and reports relevant to each of the elements of the Indigenous housing system, and also interviews with key informants. So across the 8 case studies, interviews were undertaken with 60 key informants. So the findings from the 2 stages of the research have been outlined in 2 inquiry reports, one published in 2025 and one published earlier this year, accompanied by a 3rd and final report which integrated the findings and also detailed a framework for the future national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing strategy. The inquiry research benefited greatly from being overseen by an expert Indigenous advisory committee comprised of key Indigenous housing leaders and practitioners from right across Australia. Across the course of the inquiry, the Indigenous advisory committee met on 4 occasions to inform the research design and its conduct, assist in our interpretation of our findings, and also discuss our reporting. The Indigenous Advisory Committee also informed and ratified the framework for a future national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing strategy. So, okay, moving on to outline the research findings from this large program of work, I thought it would be best to first situate these findings in a bit of historical and policy context. So our research focused on the evolving policy context since the abolition of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission in 2005. So this, for us, really marks the end of a prior era of Australian government support for greater self-determination in Indigenous affairs. Under ATSIC, Indigenous policy had a structure that provided an avenue for regional remote communities to be heard and represented in national policy making and provision. Over much of the subsequent period, national housing and homelessness policy favoured mainstreaming of service provision. So these policy approaches emphasised integrating Indigenous housing into mainstream housing systems, rather than creating separate isolated programs with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So this was particularly destructive to Indigenous community-controlled organisations and led to a considerable shrinkage of that sector. The current Closing the Gap strategy does promise some positive reform. It seeks to better respond to the needs and aspirations of Indigenous households and to promote greater self-determination and joint decision-making. So taking a bit of a closer look at Closing the Gap, this really attempts a joined-up policy approach to achieving housing, health, education, justice and employment outcomes. The revised Closing the Gap strategy is built around 4 priority reforms: formal partnerships and shared decision-making, building the community-controlled sector, transforming government organisations, and also shared access to data and information, particularly at a disaggregated level. So the 2020 refresh also includes specific housing targets. So outcome 9 is one of 17 socio-economic areas and seeks to ensure Indigenous people have access to appropriate affordable housing aligned with their priority and needs. So targets include increasing the proportion of Indigenous people living in appropriately sized housing and also raising essential services in Indigenous communities. So the reviews have indicated positive progress achieved under Closing the Gap, as well as highlighting that there's much more work that remains to be done. So in regards to housing, it was found that the expansion of the Indigenous community-controlled housing sector had not materialised, and there's also concern that the Closing the Gap housing targets are deficient. So given that historical context, one of the key questions we're asking ourselves in this research is, well, what does the current Indigenous housing system look like in Australia? Well, the answer, the short answer is that it's complex, diverse and dynamic, and indeed it evolved and changed over the course of undertaking the research. We tried to capture it in this diagram here, noting, of course, that this was last updated at the end of last year. But looking to the right of this diagram, we have the Housing and Homelessness Ministerial Council, which considers housing policy and advises National Cabinet on key priorities to address, including those faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So that cabinet is comprised of all federal, state and territory government ministers responsible for housing and homelessness. In addition, we have the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, which provides independent advice on national housing policy matters, including those impacting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. In terms of government departments, several have responsibility for aspects of national housing policy, including Treasury, whose remit expanded considerably last year, the Department of Social Services, Housing Australia, National Indigenous Australian Agency, and Indigenous Business Australia. So alongside these departments and agencies sits the Housing Policy Partnership. So this is a collaborative initiative established under Priority Reform 1 of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. And it's described as a forum for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have a genuine say in the design and delivery of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing. It is co-chaired by the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Association, NATSIHA, which is the peak body for Indigenous housing, and along with Treasury. Membership also includes representatives from state and territory governments, the Coalition of Peaks, and also independent Indigenous representatives. At the national level then, we can see that there's multiple agencies and entities that have responsibility for aspects of national housing policy and housing outcomes for Indigenous Australians. There is, however, no single agency or minister with overall responsibility. So this landscape has resulted in current governance arrangements in Indigenous housing being really fragmented and poorly coordinated, which has actually often resulted in a lack of accountability. So our research has argued for that a national comprehensive Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing strategy is required to align governance mechanisms and policies and to promote greater accountability to Indigenous peoples and communities. For future strategies to succeed, strong support from both Indigenous leaders and governments will be required, along with clearly defined roles and responsibilities for all. Governments must embrace a different approach to Indigenous housing support rather than business as usual. And finally, priority should be given to economic self-determination and enabling Indigenous-led innovation and place-based responses. Another key area of focus of the research was understanding how self-determination in Indigenous housing policy was currently being supported and how this could be strengthened moving forward. So the research found that initiatives such as Closing the Gap, the Housing Policy Partnership, and jurisdictional shared decision-making structures such as the Joint Steering Committee for Remote Housing in the NT were all really positive developments in partnering and enhancing self-determination in housing policy making. But despite these developments, there was really little evidence of significant shared decision-making occurring, and government's business as usual ways of working persisted across the Indigenous housing system. The research found that to satisfy all elements of a strong partnership model as stipulated by Closing the Gap, the HPP really needs support to develop further. Existing jurisdictional shared decision-making structures also need to be strengthened, including through long-term resourcing. There was also a need for greater clarification of roles and coordination between those different decision-making structures. Our research found that embedding Indigenous leadership and expertise within government housing agencies is a key strategy to strengthen self-determination in governance. And finally, supporting Indigenous housing peak bodies is a further critical strategy for facilitating self-determination in housing policy and provision. Okay, so far we've given you a bit of an overview of what the research found in terms of current governance arrangements and self-determination in policy. However, what does this all mean for where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live? Well, official data indicates that there are around 343,000 households with one or more members of identifying as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. So the households live across a range of tenure and landlord types. So tenures include Indigenous community-controlled housing, mainstream public and community housing, private rental and private home ownership. As this figure shows, however, the tenure mix of Indigenous households has changed over time. So the proportion of Indigenous households living in the private sector, private rental and home ownership, has increased considerably since 2001. And a flip side of this trend is the proportion of Indigenous households living in social housing has decreased over that same period. These trends have largely been driven by a contraction of social housing availability and concurrent policies that aim to divert social housing applicants to market-based alternatives. It is important to note, however, that rates of Indigenous home ownership are much lower than for non-Indigenous households, and rental tenure is often associated with rental stress and discrimination. In addition, even while it's declined over the past decade, Indigenous households are still overrepresented in social housing. So while social housing is currently mainly managed by state and territory governments across Australia, both governments and community leaders agree that community-controlled services can achieve better outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander households. This figure shows the percentage and number of social housing tenancies that were managed by registered Indigenous community-controlled housing organisations in 2024-25. So the figure clearly shows that Indigenous housing, the Indigenous housing sector is underdeveloped and is only managing a really small fraction of the total number of Indigenous social housing tenancies. Of course, Indigenous community-controlled housing organisations that do not have housing registration also manage tenancies. However, there's a lack of reliable data about the number of tenancies that they do manage. Our research found that some significant developments in the sector have occurred over recent decades. So this includes the establishment of dedicated housing peak bodies, both nationally and in state and territory jurisdictions. An increase in the number of ICHOs achieving registration under mainstream community housing systems, growth and diversification in the sector through the expansion of existing ICHOs and the establishment of new entities and organisation models via partnerships with mainstream providers. Much of this growth and diversification has been community-led and driven by community aspirations for self-determination. Growing the sector is a national priority under Closing the Gap, but there currently is a lack of detailed plans, resources and timelines for achieving this outside that which is being driven by the sector itself. Under current national commitments to support the sector, each state and territory should actually have a negotiated plan for growing and sustaining its local Aboriginal community-controlled housing organisation sector. So the research found that transferring publicly owned housing needs to be a core element of those plans. Transfer programs should be of sufficient scale to provide rental income that supports operational viability. They should also include funding for the maintenance, upgrade and replacement of housing stock, either before or immediately after it's transferred to community control, and also grant property title where possible to support the sector to leverage further resources for growth. To build the sector further, additional activities are also needed. First, there is a need to fund Indigenous housing peak bodies to lead the development of the sector's workforce, but also to provide training, education and support in nurse registration and compliance. Second, there is a need for a coordinated investment in leadership development, workforce training pathways and attraction and retention strategies. And finally, there's a need to collect robust and representative data to support effective workforce planning. Okay, one of the most innovative things that we undertook in this research was a needs analysis for Indigenous housing. So the needs analysis indicates that 45,700 low-income Indigenous households had unmet housing needs in 2021. So this represents 1 in 8 or 13% of all Indigenous households. And for comparison, that's almost double the rate recorded for all Australian households. Drivers of unmet need are unaffordable rents, overcrowding, and also inadequate housing. We found that rental stress predominates in urban and regional areas, whereas overcrowding and inadequate housing conditions are mainly found in remote areas. Unmet need is also projected to grow by another or a further 26,400 households over the next 20 years. So therefore, a final area we sought to look at in the research was the funding available to meet this current and future level of unmet need. So the research found that while there's been a recent upscaling in government investment in social and affordable housing across Australia, there's actually little transparency around the extent to which Indigenous households or organisations are benefiting. Additionally, while Closing the Gap targets to reduce overcrowding are now linked to the National Agreement on Social Housing and Homelessness, no additional or identified resources have been allocated. We heard that private financing of social housing, such as that supported through the HAF, is challenging for Indigenous organisations, and to date, most had not been able to compete successfully for that funding. Commonwealth Rent Assistance supports low-income Indigenous households to afford rental housing. However, the current level of assistance does not guard against rental stress, and it's also too low to address operating shortfalls. While successful where they do operate, the small scale of home ownership support programs has limited their impact to date. Also, we found that current lending products are not really well suited to remote communities where there's high costs of construction, maintenance and insurance, and also restrictions on private ownership of land. Addressing Indigenous housing therefore needs or requires social and affordable housing agreements to be reformed to include specific funding allocations for Indigenous housing. Funding levels must be informed by accurate projections of housing need and adjusted to reflect remote cost differentials and higher operating costs faced by many Indigenous community-controlled housing organisations. Funding models also need to take or make provision for added costs associated with the low economies of scale, the higher maintenance costs, additional tenancy management costs, and they need to invest in innovations that support self-determination. We've argued that a national Indigenous housing investment plan is what is needed. It's vital that such an investment plan is designed to optimise self-determination, is long-term in nature, contains adequate funding, and also includes an operating subsidy. Informed by our research findings and empirical evidence, and also guided by the Indigenous Advisory Committee, we developed a framework for a future Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing strategy. So the framework is aligned with the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. There's priority reforms and also the housing outcomes included within it. It was envisaged that the strategy would establish an agreed national approach to Indigenous housing, but that it would be integrated with and supported by aligned jurisdictional, regional and local plans. So the framework that we've developed for the strategy sets out a number of priority directions and actions in 4 key pillars. So the first pillar aims to strengthen governance and accountability in the Indigenous housing system. The second aims to secure sufficient investment to address current and future need for Indigenous housing. The third aims to grow and develop a sustainable Indigenous community-controlled housing sector. And the fourth aims to enhance housing tenure, security and choice across the whole housing continuum. The framework does not include consideration of reform to mainstream social housing and homelessness services or investment in site infrastructure and essential services. While they are outside of scope for this research, it is vital that these elements are included in a future national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing strategy. So I'm not going to go into any detail about the actions included under each of the 4 pillars. I just simply wanted to point out that under each of these pillars, we've included a number of priority directions, which are aligned and informed by the empirical evidence that I've just presented to you today. So late last year, a panel of government officials and Indigenous leaders reviewed the research findings and the framework and endorsed them as a strong evidence base and blueprint for action. To be clear though, what we've provided here is the framework for the development of a future Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing strategy. We've not provided the strategy itself. Any future Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander strategy needs to be developed by the Indigenous community-controlled sector. Panel members propose that the strategy development be led by the Housing Policy Partnership in line with its work plan commitment to develop a 5-year Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing plan, and it be informed by an Australian-wide, Indigenous-led and community-based consultation process. Look there, that's concludes the formal presentation of the research findings, and I'm actually going to hand back now to Shaun to facilitate a question and answer session.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Megan. There's amazing work there, and I think the conversations are definitely starting around what happens next. I just want to go back to something that you mentioned in relation to self-determination before I go to the questions on the screen. You mentioned that having positions within inside government that are dedicated for First Nations community members to define what self-determination looks like and around the housing market. Through that process, how do you feel we would need to ensure that those positions or those the community that's going into departments have decision-making power in order to influence what self-determination looks like in the housing market? We all know community that goes into government that sort of gets squashed or hidden in the background. So I just want to pick your brain on what you think needs to be in place to inside departments to ensure that First Nations community voices are actually legitimised.
Look, I mean, it's a good question. It's a hard question. I don't think I have the answers completely, but it also is a reflection. It also requires governments. It goes back to the priority reforms and ensuring that governments are held responsible and change and promote and respect cultural knowledge and cultural authority. And I think that's critical. And from a university's perspective, there's a lot of work being done institutionally to ensure that cultural knowledge is appropriately acknowledged, rewarded and remunerated. And I think it goes to those questions. I also don't think, I think it needs to be merit-based. There is a substantial wealth of knowledge from Indigenous housing leaders around Australia that needs to be celebrated and applauded, appointments that may not. I sort of get on my soapbox about this a little bit in the university sector in itself. Not all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have had the opportunity to go through formal institutional structures that enable them to secure these positions by way of a formal piece of paper. So it's actually acknowledging prior learning, prior skills, prior experience, and elevating those in the selection process.
Great. Vivienne, did you have anything to add to that?
Viv might.
Well, I just people who know me know that I have a long history with the development and formation of the Aboriginal Housing Office in New South Wales. And we looked at the Aboriginal Housing Office 25 years on, or actually more now, from its beginnings and what it achieved and what perhaps were the issues that remained with having a dedicated body administering Indigenous housing. And I won't go into all the details today, but I'll make a couple of observations. It's not a substitute for having Indigenous knowledge and cultural competency within mainstream organisations, but it is a vehicle for ensuring that there is Indigenous leadership and decision-making around Indigenous specific programs. And in the case of the AHO, it's the fact that it's statutory, that it's specialised, that it's small and focused, are some of the reasons that it has actually been influential. And the influence is seen in the fact that New South Wales has a large and diversified community-controlled sector, which almost all other jurisdictions do not have to the same extent. Victoria has a different model and is going down a very successful path. Queensland's is more fragmented, and the rest basically have disappeared because the management of housing has been handed back to government. So I think the proof is in the history of the last period, and I think a statutory body, it proceeded from being separate, which had its problems in government, to being integrated with Homes New South Wales, but still having its own powers under an act, which enable it to do different things and not to be crushed by the predominant paradigm that might apply in a bureaucracy at a point in time.
That leads me into a question that we've received online as well. We've got a question in relation to the research regarding how shared decision-making forums like NT, JSC, remote housing can be strengthened to deliberately influence more outcome and deliver things that aren't business as usual when we talk about state and federal government.
Well, I think what we said is that you need to codify the decision-making powers, and that process is going on in the Northern Territory. And then governments have to be accountable for taking decisions through the partnership and showing transparently what the discussion and the views in that partnership were before taking them to higher levels of government. What was described to us was shadow decision-making and information more than participation in shared decision-making occurring too much. And that's what Megan means when she refers to business as usual. That's how governments normally consult. And this requires a fundamental change to recognise and trust the process. And that's a two-way street, because it's not just about government being comfortable with making an open and aligned process of decision-making. It's about community accepting its responsibilities to do that within the framework of government priorities, government resources, and the wider political economic context.
And just to add to that, Viv, I think one of the some of the key elements of strengthening these shared decision-making structures included, having the political will and behind it, and that this political will shouldn't be influenced by the short-termism of political cycles. So that's where the sort of legislatory, statutory approach is so important to these structures in enabling their existence and securing their ongoing operation, but also the adequacy of funding for these structures and the adequacy of funding for participation in these structures. A lot of people give enormous amounts of time to sit on these committees and structures, which I'm sure you're too well aware of already, Shaun.
Yeah.
But without governments have a revolving door of capable public servants that are able to sit on these structures, whereas Aboriginal community control providers have a really limited amount of staff dealing with extraordinary workloads that have to add this to their existing workloads and KPIs in one sense. So I think, yes, both the political will, but the funding, both at a sort of institutional funding, but also the compensation for enabling participation.
I mean, Shaun, I think we both think that the Housing Policy Partnership is a really exciting opportunity and an incredibly positive development in Indigenous policymaking. And it needs to be protected, secured and invested in, because Indigenous policymaking has to be different. It has to be participatory and enabling, and so really governments just have to make it work, and communities.
And I think, to further to both of your points as well, is strengthening those partnerships and those arrangements, obviously, for me, means that there's going to be an outcome and a pipeline of investment to support the growth of the Aboriginal community controlled sector for housing. So we can't just strengthen to meet for the sake of it. We actually have to be meeting to ensure that the pipeline of funds and development is actually there to support. In relation to, because we speak a lot about state and federal government, state, territory and federal government and the role that they play, particularly in this space, what do you feel, or what do you see the role of local government is, particularly when we talk about the development of these partnerships and the pipeline and support? How can local government invest in supporting Aboriginal community housing outcomes?
Well, I think that has to be defined through state government plans and strategies. Local government is a partner to the Closing the Gap strategy through the ALGA, and local governments are incredibly influential in terms of their planning schemes, their community service programs, their infrastructure programs and their engagements in local communities. And all of those provide scope for local governments to play their part in implementing a state plan. I don't think we've got time now to be specific about that, but and we didn't look in detail at how many local governments have kind of officially recognised and acted on their potential to contribute to state directions and local initiatives. They would need resourcing and capacity building too, which I think is typically one of the challenges when you ask local government to take on a bigger role in a new area.
And I just caveat that by also saying, the role of local governments is also variable according to jurisdictions and regional remote sort of locations, right? So we saw in the NT that the role of local governments is actually quite significant in terms of partnering with Aboriginal community controlled housing organisations to deliver some tenancy management services, etc. So I think, it is variable, but I concur with Viv,
Yeah. In relation to some of the outcomes that we're looking for, and particularly the research that you've done, beyond simply counting the number, and this is based on the question that we received in the chat, so beyond counting the number of homes needed to account for whether these homes are, that what we need, how do we ensure through this process and through the framework that the houses are safe, they're healthy, and actually fit for purpose? I mean, climate change is a real thing, whether you believe it or not. We're dealing with huge issues around climate change, and we're also dealing with huge issues with remote and rural communities and how we manage that. How do we safeguard, or how do we move beyond bricks and mortar conversation and how many houses we need, and actually start thinking about the measurement of outcome for communities and for individuals?
Viv, do you want to go first, or
Well, just lost my train of thought there, which happens at my age. I think that one of the things that we want to do more work on is how you relate an overarching strategy and high-level targets and high-level directions to local responsiveness. And that really needs a hierarchy of plans, all the way from national to state to regional to local. And within the local context, there has to be enough flexibility and discretion, and a local decision-making process that really enables different decisions or choices to be made depending on context. So what I envisage is top-down, bottom-up, and the top is enabling. It puts the framework and the limits and the directions and the priorities around action, but it doesn't prescribe it. And the bottom-up is community by community through local decision-making processes.
Mm.
I mean, I think that was really, your mind is just amazing, Viv. The only thing I'd add to that is, the principle of self-determination is critical here. And I think in sort of fitting in with Viv's response, and the enabling of self-determination at a national level will drive local level need to be informed about what housing is built, the design, cultural appropriateness, etc. So I think giving some practical elements to that strategic description by Viv is by way of looking at what's occurring in locally at the moment. There's a lot of great initiative occurring, and building that up, but also having that enabled from a national strategy.
I'd like to give a shout out, Shaun, actually, to something that's come out since our research, because this is, as Megan said, a very dynamic context, and that's the Right Way guidelines, which have been developed for the Willijantu community in the Northern Territory. They go absolutely to the heart of how do you do climatically appropriate housing, community culturally adapted housing, safe housing, and energy efficient housing. And they're on the website of Willijantu, and they were developed in a particular community, but they're definitely adaptable across other remote communities and are a great starting point for conversation.
Mm-hmm. I kind of want to move into just a very brief conversation about some of the barriers in relation to accessibility into housing. So we know what the issues are around social housing and accessing, but we know that the private rental market is fraught with unaffordability and a level of discrimination. Moving into the home ownership space particularly as well, there's a lot of barriers there to home ownership. And one of the questions in relation to home ownership is the communally owned lands in remote and rural areas where private ownership in those spaces aren't necessarily allowed, or they're legislated against, or however they look. How do you feel that we need to resolve the issue if it is communal land and private home ownership in those environments? How do we address that? How do we create alternative forms of home ownership to support communities' economic prosperity into the future? Is my loaded question.
There's a great model staring us in the face. With another hat, I advocate for community land trusts. And community land trusts are sympathetic with and aligned with the potential to retain collective ownership of land, but enable individual control of housing, succession, some equity gain. And there's one happening right now in the Blue Mountains on what was community land that is not yet achieved, but is well down the way to being negotiated. And the Willijantu one I mentioned is also has a communal governance structure. So there are a lot of, we're currently doing some research looking at barriers such as lending practices, but you have agencies like the IBA which could lead the way here. So I think we need to support and recognise collective ownership of land, not over-press home ownership in the Western sense, and really allow local communities to determine what kind of hybrid tenures they want, and to, as you say, pull down the barriers that might prevent that happening at the moment.
It comes back to that question of self-determination as well. I mean, we talk about it in government departments and the like, but when we really get down to the nuts and bolts of it and we talk about alternative forms of housing options, particularly in the home ownership space, self-determination is kind of missing from that conversation when we talk about it. During the research and the process that you undertook, was there much collection of information about the willingness from state and territory governments to engage in sort of a national partnership conversation, or is there a reluctance there, or could you speak to a reluctance that you know of?
I think there was a healthy tension. Well, I mean, we didn't explicitly focus on that. As I said, it was very much national in focus, but looking at national structures, there was a healthy tension of, the role that states and territories and jurisdictions had in shaping the future direction of those national structures. Also, whilst not wanting to cede their own policy and provision autonomy. So I think that's where the point of what we're trying to say is that the roles and responsibilities between structures and governance arrangements needs to be further clarified and defined. And I think there was, that only comes with the maturity of those structures, I believe.
Given that this conversation around housing security and First Nations outcomes in housing has been going for a very long time, we've heard multiple people refer to homelessness, particularly in Australia, as a concept that only occurred since colonisation. Home created, or country created home, so homelessness wasn't a real thing. If we're talking about research in relation to outcomes, what do you feel in a research sense is missing to really identify some of the core practical things that we can put in place? Like, is there something that we're missing in this conversation that we need to look into deeply? That's a philosophical question. I'm really sorry.
Well, I mean, I might just add, look, one of the things that I was acutely aware of, the research that we undertook was obviously limited. Who we could speak to and the level of detail we could drill down into was obviously restricted due to timelines, budgets, etc. So I do think that further examination of local level and more jurisdictional level decision-making and governance structures is warranted, and uncovering how some of the success factors of those operations would be, I think, prove really useful moving forward. I also think the householder's voice was missing from our research, largely by, we can't cover everything. So I would encourage us to not think that this was, this is the all and be all end of where we need to focus. So I think encouragement of us engaging more with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with lived experiences of this system and understanding, their aspirations and needs in relation to housing is imperative moving forward. I think mostly I'm also increasingly interested in the workforce, considering the large challenges that were uncovered in this research being experienced by the workforce providing services and supports to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander households, not just in the Aboriginal and community controlled sector, but the whole the sector as its entirety. I also think what we missed, and it was sort of very much smack bang in our framework, is we did not look at the mainstream social housing system, and I think that's needs its own interrogation. It is increasingly an Indigenous Aboriginal, it's an Indigenous housing provision system. So I think we really needed to look at how mainstream housing providers are providing culturally appropriate and culturally safe services to its Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tenants, and how that system can, work more effectively with the Aboriginal community-controlled housing sector.
Mm.
I think, Shaun, too, that there needs to be a mind shift in terms of the role of community organisations. Governments tend to think of them as providers of social housing, and then they pigeonhole them. We've got to recognise that they can provide different models of housing, different kinds of support, hybrid tenures, as we've discussed, and not and enable the best outcomes for a local community in its context. So we've got to stop thinking of them narrowly as social housing providers and regulating away their abilities to innovate, or limiting the members of their communities who can use their services. And that's a big shift in the mindset for policymakers, I think, and for government. And I think it's one that's worth exploring what it means in practice.
Mm. And as you mentioned, Vivienne, as well, most of the First Nations community-controlled organisations delivering housing didn't start as housing providers. They've come from being health providers. They've come from criminal justice, child protection. Housing was a response to the need that they saw within their own communities and their local communities as well. Megan, going back to one final question from me, but going back to the research, you mentioned place-based, particularly around place-based deliveries of solutions and things like that. Could you give me an idea around how we uplift this conversation about place-based solutions to the issues that are there? I think we say it a lot. Everybody talks about place-based, but I mean, for me, it's just a rehashing of First Nations communities talking about country, and we've just put a nice name on it and call it place-based. But how do you see that working into the future, and how do we ensure that's embedded into the future of what we do here?
Well, I think it goes back to the structure of the strategy that Viv outlined so eloquently before and earlier, is that it's a top-down, bottom-up approach. I mean, that's how I envisage place-based. Is that place-based needs are driven by community needs and are driven from the ground up, but they're enabled from the top down. So I suppose that's the only way I could really answer that, sorry.
Well, demonstrate, devolve resources, trust communities, support them to get the outcomes, evaluate it, and spread the news.
And I guess as we're approaching, obviously, the end of the webinar as well, I'm going to give both of you an opportunity. What would be your call to action for the people who are on the webinar and who are listening in around how we can support First Nations community organisations and uplift outcomes for housing for First Nations community? What would be your key message to the sector broadly?
That's a big question, Shaun, because people are in very different places. I think I'm really impressed by the number and range of people who've come on this webinar. I think it shows how much interest there is. I think it's beholden on all of us who aren't Indigenous to read and learn about the issues, and hopefully our reports take you there to some extent and take you to a rich history of other resources. Every organisation should be having these conversations, and they should be thinking about what it means for their housing service, their housing policy, their housing responsibilities. And if we can get more alignment within our industry through community housing providers and their partnerships, through local government, as we've discussed, the formal responsibilities of state and Commonwealth government, which are enshrined in the National Agreement for Social Affordable Housing and Homelessness and in the Closing the Gap. If we can get all these more aligned and then have some priority directions, and one for mine, which I yelled loudly at the AHURI conference last year in Perth is set a target for the future numbers, future size of the Aboriginal community controlled sector, and then work toward achieving that target. I'll leave it there.
And I'll just add some really practical calls to arms. I think what fell out of our research is quite clear. There needs to be ongoing support and funding for governance structures such as the Housing Policy Partnership to enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have a say in the policies and practices that impact them. I think that another key element that fell out from the empirical research was the importance of peaks, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak bodies, both at national and jurisdictional levels. And I think there's been great, subsequent to the publication of this research, there's been some great developments in other jurisdictional areas that, such as South Australia, which I think I'd like to call out. And so that's I think the trajectory there is really strong. But yeah, ultimately, I think that there does need to be some clear aspirations set out at a national level.
Great. Well, we're coming to the end of today's webinar. So firstly, I'd like to thank both of you for coming along and joining me. As always, it's such a pleasure to sit down and chat with you around some of the issues that we're facing, but some of the really clear solutions that we can put in place to make sure that we're getting the outcomes that we need. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us and with the people online. Just a couple of quick things before we run off. We would really appreciate the people who joined us online today, your feedback by completing a survey that will be sent out to you today. We promise it's very short. There's only a few questions, so don't worry about this massive questionnaire that you're going to receive. Then we'll send you an email and let you know also once this video goes live. So if you want to share it around, or you feel as though that some people in the sector might need to sit down and listen to some of the things that Megan and Vivienne have said to us. And if you're interested about hearing further about the webinars, keep an eye out for the AHURI news, which will be in your inbox. Thank you again for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again soon, and maybe in person in Darwin at the Australian Homelessness Conference. Registrations are still open, so by all means jump online and have a look, and we'll talk soon. Thank you so much for joining me.